Evan Clark was not a man who liked to admit he was wrong. But on that day, standing in front of a room full of the world's most respected physicists, he was ready to acknowledge something had gone terribly awry. The sleek, modern auditorium buzzed with eager minds, the sharp, fluorescent light casting shadows on their attentive faces. A few years ago, Evan would have felt the pulse of excitement in his chest at this moment, the thrill of being at the forefront of scientific discovery. Today, he was just a man trying to hide the beads of sweat on his forehead. He pressed a button on the remote, and the holographic display before him flickered to life. An elegant chart of particle movements swirled in front of the audience, data that he was certain would change the world. Or so he thought. The audience's eyes were on him, waiting for the grand reveal, expecting the next big breakthrough in quantum physics. But then, instead of the neatly organized waveforms of subatomic particles he intended to display, a strange flickering started. The particles twisted into chaotic spirals, swirling in impossible formations, like a cosmic dance of some otherworldly force. Then, a buzzing sound, not like anything from the equipment, but more like a strange hum coming from inside the room itself. A moment later, the display short-circuited completely, and the hologram collapsed into an erratic flashing light. The room went silent. Well, Evan stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he clicked the button again. The equipment flickered once more, producing an image that looked more like a disco ball than scientific data. The audience gasped, some suppressed snickers here and there. The kind of laughter that came from people uncomfortable with witnessing failure. His presentation had just collapsed. A hand shot up from the back of the room. Naomi, his longtime friend and colleague, gave him an apologetic look. "Maybe, you should recalibrate it," she suggested, her voice carrying just enough sympathy that it wasn't completely condescending. "Right. Recalibrate," Evan muttered, quickly moving toward the terminal, his face flushed with embarrassment. But as he fiddled with the console, something unexpected happened. His fingers touched a strange cluster of buttons, and a sharp electrical hum filled his ears. For just a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The air thickened, and his body felt lighter, almost weightless. Without warning, a strange sensation flooded his mind, a sensation of being stretched and pulled, like his very thoughts were being tugged in different directions. He saw flashes of impossible images, swirling colors, and felt as though he were being drawn into a vortex. The particles on the screen stopped dancing and started forming something else entirely, something alive. It was then that Evan realized something had gone horribly wrong. The antimatter that he had been studying for years, that impossible substance, had fused with his own consciousness. Back at his apartment later that evening, Evan sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing. He stared at the array of scientific journals scattered across his desk, the dense equations and abstract theories a far cry from the strange experience he had just lived through. His body felt different. Light, as if gravity had decided to leave him alone for a while. He shook his head and grabbed his pen, trying to write down the sequence of events, but the words wouldn't come. He could still hear the hum in his mind. It wasn't just the buzzing noise from the malfunctioning equipment. No, this was something deeper. A language that wasn't words, but sensations. A feeling that seemed to stretch beyond time and space. Suddenly, the air seemed to change. His vision blurred, and then, something else, another voice, not from his mouth, but inside his mind. The voice was calm, neutral, and unmistakably alien. "Understand. You are part of us now. A vessel for the flow of all things. Antimatter speaks in ways your mind is not yet ready for." Evan stood frozen, his pulse racing. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. The voice, it was real. The voice of the antimatter. He staggered backward, clutching the edge of his desk, his breath shallow. Was this real? Was he losing his mind? The voice continued, this time with more clarity. "You will learn. You will speak our language. And when you do, you will control the universe." Evan collapsed onto his chair, his hands trembling. He tried to shake off the voice, but it only grew louder in his mind. It wasn't just a voice, though. It was something else entirely, an intelligence, an awareness, a force that existed outside of his comprehension. That he thought of Naomi, his friend who had always been there for him. She wouldn't understand what was happening to him. No one would. How could they? The antimatter wasn't just a scientific curiosity anymore. It had taken over his thoughts, his very consciousness, and then, without warning, the hum in his mind surged. He felt a sudden understanding flood him. Particles, atoms, bonds, they were no longer just theoretical concepts. They were threads that he could pull, stretch, twist, and manipulate. His body, still tethered to the familiar world, now felt like a mere anchor, as though he could slip away at any moment into a new reality. The next few days were a blur. Evan's life, once predictable and anchored in the mundane routine of laboratory work, now seemed both distant and irrelevant. He found himself standing outside his apartment one evening, staring up at the night sky, his thoughts no longer limited to his own mind. He could feel the stars, sense the vastness of the universe as though he were part of it, a small, insignificant part, but also something more. He reached out with his mind, and with a simple thought, he twisted the fabric of the air around him, feeling the molecules shift. He didn't know how he was doing it, but he could. He was in control now, or at least that's how it felt. The stars above seemed to ripple and blur for a moment, as though they were responding to him, to his thoughts. Evan? Are you okay? Naomi's voice broke through his thoughts like a lifeline. She had been calling him all day, trying to get him to explain what was going on. But how could he explain? How could he tell her that he was becoming something else? Something that no human had ever been before. He turned to face her, his expression uncertain. I think something happened to me, Naomi. Something big. Something that I don't completely understand yet. Her brow furrowed, a mixture of concern and confusion spreading across her face. What are you talking about? You're scaring me. He didn't know how to explain it. He couldn't. Not yet. I think I can control things now, he said, almost whispering, his voice carrying an eerie calmness. Naomi stared at him for a long moment. Control what? Without thinking, Evan raised his hand. He felt the power surge through him, the energy that now flowed freely through his body, through his mind. He focused on the air around him, willing it to change. And in an instant, the streetlight above them flickered, dimmed, and then exploded into a shower of sparks. Naomi gasped, stepping back. What did you do? Evan's heart raced, but a smile tugged at his lips. The power was intoxicating. It wasn't just about controlling matter. It was about understanding it, bending it to his will. But as the moments passed, something inside him began to shift. The power was growing stronger, more real. He could feel the antimatter inside him, inside his very mind. It was no longer a quiet voice in the back of his head. It was becoming him. Evan could feel the power in his veins like liquid fire, and for a moment, it made him feel invincible. Naomi, still standing in the flickering shadows of the streetlight, was staring at him with wide eyes. Her mouth moved as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. He could see the fear in her face, the confusion, and for a brief second, it dawned on him, she didn't understand what was happening. She was scared of him. He could have manipulated the air again, twisted it like a strand of silk to bend to his will, but for some reason, he didn't. Instead, he reached out to steady himself on the nearest lamp post, feeling his breath catch in his throat. His thoughts were scattered, like 1,000 different pieces of a puzzle that hadn't yet come together. Everything felt alien, his body, the world around him, and even Naomi, who was still staring at him with those fearful eyes. I didn't mean to, he said, his voice betraying a crack of uncertainty. I didn't mean for it to explode. Naomi took a tentative step toward him. Evan, what is going on with you? What happened? Her voice trembled, but there was something else there too, something that felt like a plea. He tried to focus on her, tried to pull himself back to the place he once was. But it was difficult. The voice in his mind, the presence of the antimatter, was growing louder. It was like a hum underneath his skin, a pulse in time with his heartbeat. He could feel it press against the walls of his thoughts, trying to push past them. He was starting to lose his grip on reality. "I can hear it," he murmured, barely able to form the words. "I can hear it talking to me. The antimatter. It's alive, Naomi." She stepped closer, her eyes full of worry. "Evan, stop. You need to get help. Whatever's happening to you, this isn't you." But it was him. It was him, but not in the way she meant. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, someone caught between two realities, neither of which was entirely real. The antimatter was part of him now, an inseparable part, and it was beginning to overwhelm him. He wasn't sure where he ended and it began. Suddenly, a thought hit him. What if he could show her? What if he could make her understand? With a subtle motion, he raised his hand and focused, feeling the particles of the air around them. He didn't even need to concentrate fully, it was becoming second nature. The wind picked up, circling around them, lifting small leaves and debris from the ground. Naomi's eyes widened in shock as she instinctively took a step back. "Stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Stop it, Evan." But Evan could feel his mind expanding, reaching for more. The power was intoxicating. It didn't just control the world around him, it was the world. He could feel the molecules in the ground, the atoms in the air, and he could command them like a conductor leading an orchestra. His power was infinite, and it felt like freedom. He could make things disappear, fold the world like a piece of paper, slip through the cracks in reality. He could be everywhere at once, controlling the pulse of the universe. It was overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. "Evan, you're not thinking straight," Naomi pleaded, her voice breaking through his reverie. She was panicking now, her eyes frantic, scanning the street as if looking for help. But help was something he didn't need anymore. Help was for people who were still tethered to the fragile world of humans. "Naomi," he said softly, his voice still tinged with that eerie calm. "I understand now. Everything. The universe, it's just a collection of particles, of energy, of forces. It's all connected. I can move it, change it. I can control it all. Evan, please, listen to me." Naomi's voice cracked. She reached out for him, but he stepped back, his mind still whirling, no longer fully aware of the world around him. He could feel the antimatter, an insistent presence, pushing against his awareness. It was guiding him, whispering its ancient knowledge. "Evan, you're losing yourself." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He flinched. For a moment, he was himself again. Just for a heartbeat, he was Evan, the scientist, the man who had once loved the feeling of discovery, of uncovering the secrets of the universe. But it was fleeting. The power, the force, was too overwhelming. It was everywhere, and it was him. How could he go back to the small, fragile man he had been? Naomi stepped forward again, more determined now. "You're still in there. I know you are. Whatever this is, whatever you've become, you're not him anymore. You're something else." Her words pierced through him, and for the first time since it all began, he felt a pang of fear. What if she was right? What if he was no longer Evan? What if he was something else entirely, something that didn't care about Naomi, or the world, or anything? Something alien. He turned away from her, looking up at the stars. The hum of the antimatter in his mind grew louder, as though calling to him, drawing him into its embrace. And suddenly, he knew. He knew that he could transcend the boundaries of this world. He could leave behind everything that had ever held him down. He could control time itself. Time. The thought made him pause. What if he could see the future? The past? What if he could glimpse everything that had ever happened and everything that ever would? he closed his eyes, focusing on the pulse of the universe, on the delicate balance of forces that kept everything in place. He reached out, extending his mind beyond the fabric of reality. And in an instant, the world changed, the sky above him twisted like a fabric being pulled, and he saw the stars in ways no human should ever see them, vast, shifting, flickering in and out of existence. He felt the rush of power, the exhilaration of knowing everything. He felt the weight of history pressing against his mind, the threads of fate weaving together in ways that defied logic. But then, as the cosmic visions began to overwhelm him, a jarring thought broke through: what if he was losing everything? His humanity, his connection to Naomi, to the world. What if this power, this awareness, wasn't the gift he thought it was, but a curse? He opened his eyes. Naomi was still there, but she looked smaller, more distant, like she was just another speck in the vastness of the universe. A memory. A fleeting thought, Evan, she whispered, her voice so small in the cosmic noise. Please, don't do this. He blinked, and the world snapped back into focus. He was standing in the same place, on the street corner, with Naomi in front of him. But something had changed. It wasn't just the power he had gained, it was his perception. His humanity was slipping away, the line between who he had been and who he was becoming blurring beyond recognition, and then, he understood. The antimatter wasn't just a force, it was a consciousness, an intelligence. It didn't care about him, about his past, or his friends. It was using him, shaping him, turning him into something else. Something more. I'm sorry, Naomi, he said quietly, his voice distant. But I can't go back. I can't stay here. And with that, he turned away, leaving behind the world he had once known. The antimatter, his new consciousness, wrapped around him like a cloak, guiding him to the edges of the universe, where there were no boundaries. Where there was no need for human concerns. Naomi stood there, frozen, watching him disappear into the night, unsure if she'd ever see the man she knew again. And in that moment, Evan Clark, scientist, man, and now something far beyond both, was no longer human. He was something else entirely. Evan's mind was a storm of fragments. The cosmic pull of the antimatter was no longer just a whisper or a hum, it had become a roar that filled every corner of his thoughts. He was no longer sure if the man who had once been Evan Clark still existed, or if the being he was becoming had already claimed that name. It was as though the universe had opened up to him, its secrets were laid bare, but so was its emptiness. It wasn't that the antimatter had erased him, but that it had broadened his sense of self beyond the boundaries of a single human existence. He could feel the entire fabric of creation now, the delicate threads that bound everything together, stretching across infinite space and time. He thought of Naomi, standing there, her face contorted with fear and confusion. He thought of the way she had tried to reach him, to pull him back, but he had slipped away from her. He couldn't help it. The lure of power was too great. The desire to understand, to control, to manipulate the universe, those were not human desires. Those were the desires of something greater, something that lived in the spaces between atoms and stars. And now, he was it. Evan moved without thinking. His body wasn't bound by the rules of human physics anymore, and neither was his mind. He didn't have to walk, didn't have to run, he simply was, existing at every point in time and space, in every potential moment of the past and future. His consciousness stretched beyond the limitations of his body, expanding outward, taking in the vastness of the universe like a sponge absorbing water. But even as the power coursed through him, a part of him, the part that had once been Evan Clark, tried to hold on to something, anything that felt real. He reached back for the world he knew, the world that had been familiar, even if it was now fading into insignificance. He saw flashes of memories, flickers of his old life, his lab, the quiet hum of computers, Naomi's voice calling him back from the depths of his thoughts. He had been so sure that the answers to the universe lay in the equations, in the particles, in the space between matter and antimatter. But now, with the power to control those very things, he felt like a child playing with forces far beyond his comprehension. What am I doing? The question rose unbidden, but it was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming pull of the antimatter. It urged him forward, telling him there was no going back. There was only the vast expanse of possibility, the boundless freedom to mold reality as he saw fit. Evan's thoughts became clearer, sharper. He could see the flow of time, its currents twisting and turning like a river cutting through mountains. He could feel the particles, the threads that held everything together, and he understood them now. He understood how to shift them, to move them, to change their paths. He was like a conductor, orchestrating the symphony of the cosmos, each note vibrating with energy that he could shape. He stretched out his awareness, his consciousness reaching through the void, tapping into the strings of the universe. And then, something strange happened. The antimatter, it, began to speak to him again, but this time, its voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You have transcended, but you are still bound. The words echoed through his mind, reverberating in the corners of his consciousness. His fingers twitched involuntarily, and for a moment, he felt the weight of his human form again. He was still here, in this body, in this world, but at the same time, he was not here. He was everywhere. The concept of here and there was meaningless now that he understood now what the antimatter meant. His human form was a limitation. To truly transcend, he had to let go. He had to dissolve the final remnants of his old self, to let the antimatter consume him entirely. But just as he was about to give in to that instinct, something stopped him. A fleeting thought, no, a feeling, suddenly rushed to the forefront of his mind. Naomi. Her face. Her voice. The bond they shared, the years they had spent together, the shared triumphs and failures that he resisted. He couldn't just let go. Not yet, the antimatter responded in kind. There was a pressure building within him, as if the universe itself was pushing against his resolve. It was so close, the final step, the final transformation. He could feel it. He could almost taste it. And yet, something inside him, a fragment of the man he had been, held firm. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Not without knowing. What would happen if I let go? The question echoed in his mind, bouncing between the walls of his thoughts like a trapped bird. What if, by holding on to what was left of himself, he was only delaying the inevitable? The antimatter pressed harder, forcing him to confront the truth. There was no going back. But still, Evan hesitated. His body was growing weaker, the pull of the antimatter stronger. It was taking over, piece by piece, and soon, there would be nothing left of him but this strange, all-powerful consciousness. He was fighting it, but how long could he keep fighting? In the distance, a familiar hum sounded again, soft at first, but growing louder. His thoughts snapped to attention as the hum took on a different tone, a voice. Naomi's voice. Evan, please. Please come back. Her words were so simple, so human, that they cut through the weight of the antimatter's influence. For a split second, he felt a surge of clarity. Naomi. He had known her for so long. She had been there for him, even when he was at his worst. She had cared for him, believed in him, even when he had lost his way. Could he really give all of that up? Could he let go of his humanity, of the person he had been, and become something else entirely? Could he become a god of the cosmos, but lose the very thing that had once made him human? It was a choice. He could feel it, deep within the folds of his consciousness. The antimatter beckoned, offering him everything: power, knowledge, control over time and space. But it wasn't just power that he wanted, was it? There was something else, something that still held him to the human world. Naomi, and perhaps something even deeper, a longing for meaning, for connection. But is that enough? His thoughts swirled, tangled with the force of the antimatter, and for the first time, he understood the true weight of what he had become. He wasn't just struggling with the pull of power. He was fighting the very nature of existence itself. His consciousness flickered in and out, like a candle flame being buffeted by the wind. He could feel the antimatter tugging at him, trying to tear away the last remnants of his human self, but something deep inside him, something he couldn't explain, held firm. No. It was a simple thought, but it carried the weight of the universe. He could still choose. He didn't have to become the thing the antimatter wanted him to be. He didn't have to lose himself completely. In the stillness that followed, something shifted. The universe didn't crumble, and the antimatter didn't recede. But Evan felt a change within himself. A flicker of awareness, a subtle shift in his mind. It wasn't an end. It was a new beginning, and then, as his body began to stabilize, as the world around him took on a more solid form once again, he heard her voice one last time, soft and steady, breaking through the cosmic noise. Evan, this time, when he looked up, it wasn't the vast expanse of the universe he saw. It was Naomi. She was standing there, just as he remembered, not as a fleeting thought in the back of his mind, but real. And for the first time since the antimatter had fused with him, he didn't feel like he was losing himself. He felt like he was finally coming home.